October 17, 1877. West Texas, just beyond the Pecos River. Texas Ranger James Gillette crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his half-wild coyote Lobo paw frantically at the red clay earth. The animal's behavior had been strange for days, circling, whining, refusing food. But this morning, Lobo had bolted from camp before sunrise, leading Gillette on a 3-mile chase into Apache territory where white men rarely ventured and lived to tell about it. What Gillette found when he caught up to the animal made him reach for his revolver, then his rosary. Lobo sat beside a shallow depression in the ground, head tilted back, releasing a sound Gillette had never heard from the creature, something between a howl and a human scream. The earth around the animal's paws was darker than the surrounding clay. Fresher, recently disturbed, Gillette began to dig with his bare hands. Within minutes he uncovered the first body, then another, then another. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple massacre, because these victims had been dead for weeks, yet someone had been moving them. Before we uncover the truth about the Texas Ranger's Coyote and the horrifying discovery that would expose one of the darkest chapters in the Texas frontier, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We bring you the forgotten horrors of American history, the stories they didn't want you to remember. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's step back to the scorching summer of 1877, when the Texas frontier was a lawless expanse where men reinvented themselves and secrets stayed buried in the unforgiving soil. The year 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of what historians would call the Gilded Age, a period of rapid expansion, industrial growth, and systematic erasure of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. But in West Texas, along the Pecos River, civilization remained a fragile concept, a thin veneer painted over violence and survival. Fort Davis, established in 1854, served as the primary military installation protecting settlers, mail routes, and freight wagons from Comanche and Apache raids. The fort housed companies of the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, and a rotating contingent of Texas Rangers who operated with near absolute authority in the territories beyond federal jurisdiction. The landscape itself was unforgiving. Temperatures in summer exceeded 110 degrees. Water sources were scarce, contaminated, or controlled by hostile forces. The Comanche, facing extinction and forced relocation, conducted desperate raids on settlements, stealing horses, cattle, and occasionally taking captives. The Apache, masters of desert warfare, moved like ghosts through the mountains and canyons, appearing and vanishing with supernatural precision. Into this volatile environment came James Thomas Gillette, a 28-year-old Texas Ranger with a reputation for tracking skills that bordered on the supernatural. Fellow Rangers whispered that Gillette could follow a trail 3 weeks old, could predict where a fugitive would run before the fugitive knew himself. Gillette credited his success to patience, observation, and his unusual companion, a half-coyote, half-dog hybrid he'd raised from a pup after finding it abandoned near a burned-out homestead. Gillette called the animal Lobo, Spanish for wolf. The creature was smaller than a full-blood coyote, with amber eyes and a coat that shifted between gray and rust brown depending on the light. Lobo slept at Gillette's feet, ate from his hand, and followed him across the most treacherous terrain without complaint. Rangers at Fort Davis viewed the animal with suspicion, seeing it as bad luck, an omen of death. Some whispered that Gillette had made a deal with something dark to gain his tracking abilities. Gillette ignored the superstition. He was a praw. Tickle Man, a veteran of the Confederate Army who'd learned that survival required focus, discipline, and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. He'd joined the Rangers in 1875, 2 years after the organization had been reinstated following its disbandment during Reconstruction. The Rangers operated under minimal oversight, answering primarily to themselves and to the political interests of Texas's expanding cattle and railroad industries. In August 1877, Gillette received orders to investigate a series of disappearances near the settlements between Fort Davis and Fort Stockton. Over a period of 6 weeks, 11 people had vanished, mostly Mexican laborers working on railroad surveying crews, but also 3 white settlers, including a woman and her 2 children. The disappearances followed a pattern. Individuals would leave camp or their homestead to check on livestock, fetch water, or hunt game, and simply never return. The prevailing theory blamed Comanche raiders. It was convenient, required no complex investigation, and justified the ongoing military campaigns to push indigenous peoples onto reservations. But something about the pattern troubled Gillette. The victims were taken alone, during daylight hours, within sight of other people. No shots were fired, No horses were stolen. No witnesses reported seeing anything unusual. It didn't fit the profile of Comanche raids, which were typically swift, violent, and designed to maximize material gain while minimizing risk to the raiders. Gillette began his investigation at Fort Stockton, interviewing witnesses, examining the locations where people were last seen. He found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. It was as if the victims had simply stepped through a doorway into another dimension. Then, in early October, Lobo's behavior changed. October 3, 1877, Gillette camped near Comanche Springs, approximately 30 miles north of Fort Stockton. He'd spent the day examining the site where a railroad surveyor named Miguel Reyes had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. Reyes had been working with a crew of 6 men, setting markers for the proposed route of the Texas and Pacific Railway. According to witnesses, Reyes had walked approximately 50 yards from the group to relieve himself behind a cluster of mesquite bushes. When he didn't return after 20 minutes, the crew went looking for him. They found nothing. No tracks leading away, no signs of violence, no indication he'd ever been there at all. That evening, as Gillette prepared his bedroll, Lobo began to pace. The animal walked in tight circles around the campfire, stopping periodically to stare into the darkness beyond the firelight. Gillette had seen this behavior before, usually when predators, mountain lions or wolves, prowled nearby. But when he stood, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness, he saw nothing, heard nothing except the wind and the distant yipping of coyotes. Lobo suddenly bolted into the darkness. Gillette cursed, grabbed a torch and pursued the animal. He found Lobo 200 yards from camp, digging furiously at the base of a limestone outcropping. The animal's paws were bleeding, claws torn from scraping against rock. Gillette pulled Lobo away from the rocks and examined the area with his torch. There was nothing there, just stone and sand and the scattered remains of ancient seashells, remnants from when this desert had been an ocean floor millions of years ago. But when Gillette turned to leave, Lobo attacked him. The animal had never shown aggression toward Gillette before, but now it lunged, snapping at his legs, trying to drive him back toward the limestone outcropping. Gillette stumbled backward, genuinely frightened. Lobo's eyes reflected the torchlight with an intensity that seemed almost human, almost intelligent in a way that transcended animal instinct. Then, just as suddenly, the aggression ceased. Lobo sat down, head bowed, whimpering. Gillette spent the rest of the night by the fire, watching his companion with new wariness. The animal didn't sleep, didn't eat, just stared into the darkness as though watching something Gillette couldn't see. October 8, 1877, Gillette received a telegram at Fort Stockton, another disappearance. A woman named Sarah Pritchard, 34 years old, had vanished from her homestead 12 miles east of the fort. Her husband, Thomas Pritchard, had been working in their small cornfield when he heard her scream. He ran back to the house to find the front door open, a pot of stew overturned on the kitchen floor, and no sign of his wife. Gillette rode to the Pritchard homestead with Lobo trotting alongside his horse. The scene was exactly as Thomas Pritchard described: the overturned pot, the open door, the eerie absence of any evidence explaining what had happened. But when Gillette brought Lobo into the house, the animal's behavior became erratic. Lobo moved from room to room, sniffing the air, the floors, the walls. In the bedroom, the animal froze, staring at the space beneath the bed. Gillette knelt down, looked underneath. Nothing but dust and a few scattered buttons. But when he stood up, Lobo had climbed onto the bed itself, walking in circles on the quilt, whining in that same disturbing way, a sound that seemed to carry human anguish. Thomas Pritchard stood in the doorway, watching. "That animal is possessed," he said, his voice flat with shock. "It knows something we don't." Gillette had no response. He couldn't argue. That night, camping a mile from the Pritchard homestead, Lobo vanished again. This time, Gillette didn't pursue. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, and waited. The animal returned 2 hours later, covered in dust and scratches, something dark staining its muzzle. Gillette assumed it was blood from a kill, but when he examined it more closely, it wasn't blood. It was clay. Red clay, the type found deeper in the earth, not surface soil. Lobo had been digging again, somewhere, for something. October 12, 1877. A Mexican laborer named Eduardo Salazar stumbled into Fort Stockton at dawn, barely conscious, his clothes torn, his feet bloody. He'd been missing for 9 days. The fort surgeon treated him for dehydration, exposure, and severe psychological trauma. When Salazar could finally speak, his account made no sense. He claimed he'd been taken underground. Salazar had been working with a crew repairing a water pump 3 miles from the fort when something grabbed him from behind. He described hands, many hands, pulling him down into the earth. He remembered darkness, the smell of decay, the sound of scraping and digging. He remembered voices speaking in a language that wasn't English, Spanish, or any indigenous language he recognized. He remembered being moved, dragged through tunnels, through spaces so tight he could barely breathe. Then, suddenly, he was released. Pushed up through the earth like a body being exhumed, he found himself alone, disoriented, miles from where he'd been taken. The fort commander dismissed Salazar's account as the delusions of a man driven mad by thirst and heat. But Gillette interviewed Salazar personally and found his story disturbingly consistent. The man wasn't raving or confused. He was terrified, yes, but his memory of events was clear and detailed. Gillette asked one question: "Did you see who took you?" Salazar's response would haunt Gillette for the rest of his life. Not who, what. October 15, 1877, Gillette made a decision that violated every protocol, every regulation governing ranger operations. He would follow Lobo wherever the animal led him, even if it meant crossing into Apache territory, even if it meant going alone without backup or authorization. That night he removed Lobo's collar and whispered to the animal, "Show me." The coyote dog looked at him with those amber eyes, tilted its head as though considering the request, then turned and began walking north, away from the settlements, away from the forts, into the wilderness where the map said nothing existed but empty space. Gillette followed. For 2 days they traveled through terrain that grew increasingly hostile. Narrow canyons, fields of volcanic rock that shredded boot leather, dry creek beds where bones from ancient creatures protruded from the stone. Lobo never hesitated, never deviated from his path. The animal was following something Gillette couldn't detect, a scent, a sound, some sensory input beyond human perception. On the morning of October 17th, they reached the place. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. This is one of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered, and it only gets darker from here. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries, but maybe wait until daylight. Let's discover what Ranger Gillette found when he finally stopped digging. The site was unremarkable, a shallow depression in the red clay earth, surrounded by creosote bushes and scattered chunks of limestone. No markers, no cairns, nothing to indicate this location held any significance, but Lobo sat beside it, releasing that terrible sound, part howl, part human scream, and began to dig. Gillette joined him. Within minutes his hands struck something solid but yielding. Cloth. He brushed away more soil, revealing a piece of fabric, a woman's dress, faded blue calico. He dug deeper, working carefully now, and uncovered a shoulder, an arm, a face. Sarah Pritchard, the woman who'd disappeared 9 days earlier. Her eyes were open. Her mouth was filled with dirt. Gillette's training took over. He noted the position of the body, supine, arms at her sides, positioned with deliberate care. He noted the absence of obvious trauma, the strange preservation of the corpse despite the heat. He noted the depth of the grave, barely 18 inches, a shallow burial that suggested haste or interruption. Then he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The soil beneath and around Sarah Pritchard's body was different from the surrounding earth. It was darker, richer, mixed with something organic. Gillette lifted a handful, smelled it, and recognized the distinctive odor of human waste, decomposition, the biological residue of death. This wasn't the original burial site. The body had been moved here. Recently. Lobo began digging again 5 feet to the left. Gillette found the second body within minutes. Miguel Reyes, the railroad surveyor. Positioned identically to Sarah Pritchard, supine, arms at sides, mouth filled with earth. Dead for approximately 3 weeks based on decomposition, yet buried in soil that had been disturbed within the last few days. Lobo dug again. A third body. A fourth. A fifth. By noon, Gillette had uncovered 11 bodies. All the victims from the disappearances over the past 6 weeks. All positioned identically. All buried in recently disturbed earth despite having been dead for varying lengths of time. Someone had been digging them up and reburying them, moving them, arranging them. But the horror didn't end there. As Gillette examined the grave sites more carefully, he noticed a pattern in their placement. The bodies formed a shape, a rough circle, with one space remaining empty. The circle was approximately 20 feet in diameter, and at its center, the earth was disturbed in a different way. Something had been buried there too, then removed. Gillette began to dig in the center of the circle. 3 feet down, he struck wood, a crude box roughly constructed from scavenged lumber. He pried it open with his knife. Inside, he found bones. Human bones, but arranged incorrectly, assembled in configurations that defied anatomy. A rib cage mounted where a pelvis should be. Leg bones arranged in a spiral pattern. A skull placed face down, jaw removed, eye sockets filled with river stones. And beneath teeth, bones, written in charcoal on the bottom of the box, a single word in Spanish, renacimiento, rebirth. Gillette sat back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a Comanche raid. This wasn't Apache violence. This was something else entirely. Something methodical, ritualistic, insane. Lobo began to growl, a low rumble that Gillette felt more than heard. The animal was staring at something beyond the graves, toward a cluster of boulders approximately 50 yards away. Gillette drew his revolver and approached slowly. As he rounded the boulders, he found the entrance to a cave, or more accurately, a mine shaft. Old, abandoned, partially collapsed. The wooden support beams were rotted, the entrance half blocked by fallen rock. But the tracks leading in and out were fresh. Human tracks, bare feet, multiple individuals moving in and out repeatedly over a period of weeks. Gillette lit a torch and entered the mine. The shaft descended at a steep angle, the walls showing evidence of hand excavation, pick marks, chisel gouges, the systematic removal of stone over years or decades. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something chemical that burned Gillette's nostrils and made his eyes water. 20 feet in, the shaft opened into a chamber approximately 15 feet across, and here Gillette found the answer to where the missing bodies had been kept. The chamber walls were lined with alcoves, crude niches carved into the stone. Each alcove had contained a body. Gillette could see the staining, the biological residue, the marks where corpses had rested for days or weeks before being removed and reburied outside in that terrible circle. But the chamber held more than empty alcoves. On the floor, arranged with meticulous care, Gillette found the victim's personal effects. Sarah Pritchard's wedding ring, Miguel Reyes's pocket watch, a child's wooden toy, a leather Bible, a hair comb. Each item placed in a specific position, arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of ritual significance, and on the far wall, written in the same charcoal as the word in the bone box, a message, Dos almas para uno. El último vendrá por voluntad propia. 12 souls for one. The last will come by choice. 11 bodies had been found. One space remained in the circle. Someone was still out there, someone was still active, and they were waiting for a 12th victim. Gillette stumbled out of the mine shaft, gasping for clean air. His hands were shaking. His training, his experience, his years of dealing with frontier violence. None of it had prepared him for this. Lobo sat outside the entrance, perfectly still, watching the horizon. Gillette understood then why the animal had been so disturbed, so frantic. Lobo had smelled death, not fresh death, but the repeated handling of the dead, the obsessive movement and arrangement of corpses. The animal had detected something fundamentally wrong with this place, something that violated natural order. Gillette needed to report this immediately, needed to get reinforcements, needed to organize a manhunt. But as he prepared to ride back to Fort Stockton, he made a critical decision. He would leave Lobo here, the animal would guard the site, would alert him if anyone returned. It was a decision Gillette would regret for the rest of his life. Gillette rode through the night, covering the 30 miles to Fort Stockton in just under 5 hours, nearly killing his horse in the process. He arrived at dawn on October 18th, demanding an immediate meeting with the fort commander and the county sheriff. What followed was a masterclass in institutional denial and political self-preservation. Fort Commander Colonel Marcus Whitfield listened to Gillette's report with visible skepticism. The idea that someone had been systematically kidnapping people, murdering them, and conducting bizarre rituals with their bodies was simply too fantastic to accept. Whitfield's concern wasn't victims, it was the political fallout. The railroad companies had invested millions in surveying and developing West Texas. News of a serial killer operating freely in the territory would destroy investor confidence, halt expansion, and potentially end Whitfield's military career. Sheriff Daniel Morrison was more direct. You're telling me you found 11 bodies arranged in a circle, and you think some madman is collecting souls for a ritual? Ranger Gillette, that sounds like the ravings of a man who spent too long in the sun. But Gillette had evidence, the personal effects he'd taken from the mine shaft, the precise locations of the grave sites, the physical evidence of the ritualistic burial. He insisted on organizing an immediate expedition to the site. Whitfield agreed, but with conditions. The expedition would be small. Gillette, Morrison, 4 soldiers, and a Mexican tracker named Tomas Guerrero who'd worked with the fort for 15 years. They would leave immediately but maintain absolute secrecy. No word would reach the press, the settlers, or the railroad companies until they had a complete understanding of the situation. The expedition reached the site on the evening of October 18th, approximately 30 hours after Gillette had left. Lobo was gone. The grave sites remained as Gillette had left them, 11 disturbed patches of earth, bodies partially exposed to confirm their presence. But the Coyote dog was nowhere to be found. Gillette called for the animals, searched the surrounding area, found nothing. Tomas Guerrero examined the site with practiced efficiency. He confirmed Gillette's findings, noted additional details about the burial patterns, and made an observation that Gillette had missed. The ritualistic arrangement of the bodies corresponded to the constellation Pleiades, known in Mexican folklore as Las Siete Cabrillas, the 7 little goats. But this version had 11 points instead of 7, suggesting an expanded or corrupted version of the traditional pattern. As darkness fell, the expedition made camp near the site. Sheriff Morrison insisted on examining the mine shaft himself, despite Gillette's warnings about the disturbing nature of what he'd find inside. Morrison descended into the shaft with a torch and 2 soldiers. They were gone for approximately 20 minutes. When they emerged, Morrison was vomiting. The soldiers looked shaken, traumatized. One of them, a young private named William Curtis, was weeping openly. Morrison couldn't speak for several minutes. When he finally regained composure, he told Gillette, "There's more, deeper in the shaft. You didn't go far enough." The expedition descended together this time, armed and prepared for anything. They moved past the chamber Gillette had discovered, deeper into the mine shaft where it narrowed and twisted. 50 feet beyond the chamber, they found a second room. This one was smaller, more carefully constructed, with stone walls that had been smoothed and fitted with remarkable precision. And here, they found the horror that would define the case. The walls were covered in writing, thousands of words scratched into the stone with metal tools, written in Spanish, English, and what appeared to be Nahuatl, an ancient Aztec language. The text rambled, repeated, contradicted itself, but certain themes emerged: resurrection, transformation, the thin boundary between life and death, the possibility of bringing back what had been lost, and in the center of the room, they found the workbench. It was constructed from railroad ties, stolen from one of the surveying camps. On its surface were tools, saws, knives, medical instruments, some crude and improvised, others sophisticated and precise, and scattered around the tools were anatomical drawings, sketches showing how human bodies could be disassembled and reassembled, how organs could be repositioned, how bones could be restructured into new configurations. The expedition found journals too, written accounts detailing each abduction, each murder, each burial. The writer described their work with clinical detachment, referring to the victims as materials and components. They wrote about their goal to create a perfect vessel through the combination of 12 souls, to achieve a transformation that would transcend death itself. The final journal entry was dated October 16th, the day before Gillette had discovered the site. The 11th component has been positioned. The final component must come freely, must choose the transformation. The animal knows, the animal will bring the last. Sheriff Morrison looked at Gillette with dawning horror. "Lobo, they took your Coyote." A search of the surrounding area revealed tracks leading away from the site. Human tracks, bare feet, and the paw prints of a canine being dragged or carried. The tracks headed northeast, toward the Guadalupe Mountains and the complex network of canyons, where a fugitive could hide indefinitely. Colonel Whitfield made a command decision. They would return to Fort Stockton, organize a proper manhunt with 50 soldiers and every available ranger, and track down the perpetrator before they could complete their ritual. But Gillette refused to leave. He would not abandon Lobo. He would not wait for bureaucratic authorization and military planning. He would track the perpetrator immediately, alone if necessary. After hours of argument, a compromise was reached. Gillette would pursue the trail with Tomas Guerrero and 2 soldiers while the main force returned to Fort Stockton to organize reinforcements. They would rendezvous in 72 hours at a predetermined location, or Gillette would be declared lost and presumed dead. The tracking party departed at first light on October 19th. The trail led them through increasingly difficult terrain, box canyons, knife-edge ridges, areas where one misstep meant a 100-foot fall onto jagged rocks. But Guerrero was a master tracker, able to follow signs that were invisible to Gillette. A disturbed stone here, a broken twig there, the faint scent of wood smoke carried on the wind. On the second day, they found Lobo. The animal was alive but injured, tied to a mesquite tree with rawhide cord. Its muzzle was wrapped in cloth to prevent biting. When Gillette cut the animal free, Lobo collapsed into his arms, whimpering with pain and relief. Guerrero examined the area around the tree. "This was bait," he said quietly. "They wanted you to find him, they wanted you to come." Gillette understood the implication but didn't care. He had his companion back, that was all that mattered. They continued tracking, now following footprints that were no longer attempting to hide. The perpetrator was leading them somewhere specific, moving with purpose toward a destination. On October 21st, they found him. The man sat at the entrance to a small cave, approximately 50 miles northeast of the original burial site. He was in his mid-40s, gaunt from malnutrition, his skin darkened by sun exposure. He wore the remnants of what had once been a priest's cassock, now little more than rags. His feet were bare, calloused to the point of resembling leather. His hands were covered in scars from years of manual labor. He was holding a knife to his own throat. "Mi nombre es Padre Felipe Morales," he said in Spanish, his voice surprisingly calm. "Y he estado esperando. My name is Father Felipe Morales, and I have been waiting." Gillette approached slowly, hand on his revolver. "Waiting for what?" Morales smiled. "Para completar el trabajo, para ser el duodécimo, to complete the work, to be the 12th. Guerrero translated, though Gillette had understood most of it. The priest wasn't waiting for capture, he was waiting for death. He intended to be the final component of his own ritual, the 12th soul in his circle of transformation. "You killed 11 people," Gillette said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You moved their bodies, I preserved them," Morales interrupted, switching to accented English. "I prepared them for rebirth. Each soul contributes to the whole. Each death creates the possibility of ultimate life." The man was insane, completely, irredeemably insane. But his madness was methodical, structured around a coherent, if horrifying internal logic. Gillette needed answers. He needed to understand how this had happened, how a priest had become a serial killer, how these 11 people had died. So he lowered his weapon and asked Morales to explain. What followed was a confession that took nearly 3 hours. Morales spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English, his words tumbling out in a torrent of religious fervor, pseudoscientific theory, and profound grief. Felipe Morales had been a missionary priest working among the indigenous communities of northern Mexico. In 1868, a cholera epidemic had swept through his mission, killing over 200 people, including his younger sister who had accompanied him from Spain. Morales had prayed, had performed last rites, had buried the dead according to Catholic tradition, but the experience had broken something fundamental in his faith. He became obsessed with the idea of resurrection, not as a spiritual metaphor but as a physical reality. He studied ancient Aztec texts about the cyclical nature of death and rebirth. He corresponded with spiritualists in Europe who claimed to have contacted the dead. He experimented with techniques to preserve corpses, to prevent decomposition, to keep the body ready for the soul's return. The Catholic Church excommunicated him in 1871. Morales fled to Texas, living as a hermit in the wilderness, continuing his research in isolation. He discovered the abandoned mine shaft, an old Spanish silver mine from the colonial period, and converted it into his laboratory. He survived by stealing from railroad camps, by scavenging, by moving like a ghost through the territories. And then he began taking victims. The first was a Mexican laborer who had mocked Morales' beliefs, called him a madman. Morales killed him with a rock, quickly, efficiently, surprised by how easy it was. He buried the body in the mine shaft, performed rituals over it for days, waiting for signs of resurrection. Nothing happened. So Morales developed a new theory. Perhaps resurrection required multiple souls, a collective energy strong enough to transcend death. He created his circle pattern based on the Pleiades constellation, a symbol of rebirth in multiple cultures. He calculated that 12 souls, 12 sources of spiritual energy, might create the necessary conditions for transformation. He began hunting systematically, choosing victims who were alone, isolated, unlikely to be missed immediately. He perfected his technique, approach from behind, apply a cloth soaked in chloroform stolen from a medical supply wagon, drag the unconscious victim to the mine shaft, kill them in the chamber. Methods varied: strangulation, suffocation, occasionally a quick knife to the throat, position them in the alcoves and wait. When the bodies showed signs of advanced decomposition, he would move them outside, bury them in the circular pattern, and return for the next victim. "I never enjoyed the killing," Morales said, his voice distant, as if describing someone else's actions. "It was necessary, like a surgeon cutting flesh to cure disease, temporary pain for ultimate healing." Gillette felt rage building in his chest. These weren't components or materials. They were people. Sarah Pritchard had a husband who wept every night. Miguel Reyes had a mother in Mexico City who would never know what happened to her son. But before Gillette could respond, Morales pressed the knife harder against his own throat, drawing blood. "I am ready to complete the ritual," he said. 12 souls, 12 points of light, 12 gateways to transformation. When I join them, when my blood feeds the earth where they rest, the circle will be complete. Something new will be born. Something that transcends this failed flesh. Gillette made a decision in that moment. He holstered his revolver and spoke directly. "No." Morales looked confused. "No? You don't get to die on your own terms. You don't get to be the 12th soul. You're going to stand trial. You're going to face the families of the people you murdered. You're going to hang from a rope in a public square while everyone you victimized watches. That's your transformation." For the first time, Morales' composure cracked. The priest lunged forward, knife aimed at Gillette's throat, screaming in Spanish about destiny and completion and the necessity of sacrifice. Lobo, still weak from his captivity, launched himself at Morales' legs. The priest stumbled, fell, and the knife flew from his hand. Gillette and Guerrero subdued him within seconds, binding his hands with rawhide, gagging him to stop the screaming. Padre Felipe Morales was transported to Fort Stockton on October 22, 1877. He was tried in El Paso in December of that year on 11 counts of murder. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Morales was hanged on February 3, 1878, in the public square of El Paso, before a crowd of over 2,000 people. According to witnesses, he maintained his composure until the moment the trapdoor opened, at which point he screamed a single word: "Renacimiento." His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city limits. The location was deliberately kept secret to prevent his followers. There were rumors of a small cult that had formed around his writings from recovering the corpse for their own rituals. The Morales case sent shockwaves through Texas law enforcement and fundamentally changed how authorities approached missing persons investigations on the frontier. Prior to 1877, disappearances in remote areas were routinely attributed to indigenous raids, wild animal attacks, or simple desertion. The assumption was that the wilderness itself was the threat. That danger came from external, predictable sources. Morales proved that the greatest danger could come from within, from someone who appeared civilized, educated, even holy. In 1878, the Texas legislature passed the Frontier Victims Act, which required systematic documentation of all disappearances in territories beyond established municipal boundaries. County sheriffs were mandated to investigate each case personally, rather than defaulting to assumptions about Indian raids. The act also allocated funding for expanded ranger operations and established the first crude database of missing persons. More significantly, the case influenced the emerging field of criminal psychology. Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, the Austrian psychiatrist who would later publish Psychopathia Sexualis, corresponded with Texas authorities about the Morales case, using it as an example of what he termed religious mania combined with homicidal compulsion. The case appeared in medical journals throughout the 1880s as evidence that certain forms of mental illness could transform previously functional individuals into calculating killers. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, conducted an internal investigation into how Morales had been ordained, educated, and assigned to missionary work, without any indication of his psychological instability. The investigation revealed disturbing gaps in the Church's evaluation processes, leading to reforms in how candidates for priesthood were screened for mental fitness. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the collective psychology of frontier communities. The Morales case destroyed the comforting myth that evil was always external, always other. Settlers could no longer assume that threats came only from hostile Indians or wild animals. They had to acknowledge that monstrosity could emerge from their own ranks, from someone who spoke their language, shared their faith, and walked among them undetected. Historians have identified at least 3 other similar cases in the American West between 1878 and 1895 that show clear influence from Morales's methodology: ritualistic burial patterns, religious justifications for murder, targeting of isolated victims. None achieved the same scale or generated the same publicity, but they demonstrated that Morales wasn't unique. He was part of a broader phenomenon of frontier violence that combined isolation, religious extremism, and psychological breakdown. The 11 victims were eventually returned to their families or buried in marked graves in Fort Stockton Cemetery. Sarah Pritchard was interred next to her parents in San Antonio. Miguel Reyes's body was transported to Mexico City, where his mother held a funeral mass attended by over 300 people. The other victims, mostly laborers with few living relatives, were buried in a collective plot donated by the railroad companies, marked with a simple stone that read, "Victims of Evil, Remembered by the Just." Thomas Pritchard, Sarah's widower, never remarried. He sold his homestead and moved back east, unable to remain in the territory where his wife had suffered such a terrible death. Before leaving, he visited Gillette at Fort Davis and asked a single question: did she suffer? Gillette lied. He told Pritchard that the evidence suggested Morales had used chloroform, that Sarah had been unconscious when she died, that she felt no pain. The truth, based on Morales's own confession, was far worse. Some victims had been awake, some had begged, some had fought. But Gillette gave Thomas Pritchard the mercy of a comfortable lie, because sometimes mercy matters more than truth. The mine shaft was dynamited and sealed on November 15, 1877. The burial site was left undisturbed initially, but within months souvenir hunters and the morbidly curious had trampled the area into uselessness. Eventually, wind and rain erased all surface evidence that anything had occurred there. Today, the location is unmarked and largely forgotten, known only to a handful of local historians who can approximate its position based on Gillette's reports. James Gillette continued serving as a Texas Ranger until 1882, when he resigned to become a rancher near Austin. He never spoke publicly about the Morales case, refusing all interview requests from journalists and researchers. His personal journals from that period were destroyed by his daughter after his death in 1918, at his specific request. But those who knew Gillette said he was never quite the same after October 1877. He became more reserved, more cautious about human nature, less willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. He'd seen what existed beneath the veneer of civilization, and the knowledge had marked him. Lobo, the half-wild coyote who had led Gillette to the burial site and saved his life during Morales's final attack, lived until 1889. The animal never fully recovered from the trauma of captivity, developing a fear of confined spaces and an aversion to strangers. But it remained loyal to Gillette until its death, sleeping at his feet, following him across his ranch, serving as a living reminder of the darkness they'd confronted together. When Lobo died, Gillette buried the animal on his property, under a live oak tree, with a marker that read simply, "Faithful Friend." The Morales case raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. How do we identify potential killers before they act? What responsibility do institutions, churches, governments, communities have in monitoring those who show signs of dangerous mental illness? And perhaps most disturbingly, how many other predators operated on the American frontier? In those vast empty spaces where people disappeared and were never found, where evidence was erased by wind and time, where the crimes were attributed to eons or accidents or simple bad luck. We'll never know the full answer to that question. But the Morales case suggests that the number was higher than we'd like to believe. The wilderness kept its secrets, and sometimes those secrets wore a human face. What do you think drove Padre Felipe Morales to such acts? Was it genuine madness, religious delusion, or something darker? A conscious choice to embrace evil while hiding behind the language of faith? Leave your theories in the comments below. Our community always brings fascinating perspectives on these historical mysteries. If you found this story as disturbing as we did, subscribe to the Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of American history, the stories they didn't want you to remember. We upload new videos every week, diving deep into the forgotten horrors that shaped our nation. And remember, the wilderness is no longer wild, but the darkness that lived there hasn't disappeared. It just found new places to hide. See you in the next video.